Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. I rented a small cabin in the woods for a week, hoping to get away from the city and all the noise. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat, just me and my thoughts. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by thick trees, with no neighbors for miles. At first, it was exactly what I needed. Quiet, simple, just nature. But then things started to get weird. The first evening, as the sun was setting, I was sitting on the porch with a beer in hand, watching the woods. That's when I noticed him. There was a man standing at the edge of the trees, just watching me. He wasn't moving, just staring. He had on a plaid shirt, dirty jeans, and a weathered face. I didn't think too much of it at first. Figured he might just be some local wandering around, so I waved. He didn't wave back. He just turned and walked into the trees. The next evening, around the same time, I saw him again. Same spot, same clothes. He stood there for longer this time, watching me, not moving. It was starting to feel strange. I waved again, trying to be friendly, but he didn't respond. He just disappeared back into the trees after a while. I felt uneasy but told myself it was nothing. The third evening, I saw him again. He was closer this time, just past the tree line. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. I stood up and called out, asking if he needed anything, but he didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching me like before. Something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. He looked like he belonged in the woods, like part of the forest itself, rough and worn down. When he turned to leave, I watched until he was out of sight. The next day, I decided to confront him if I saw him again. It wasn't sitting right with me, this guy just lurking around every evening. That night, as expected, he showed up again, standing even closer this time. I could see the lines on his face, the way his eyes seemed hollow in the fading light. I marched over to the edge of the property, keeping my distance but close enough to talk. "Hey," I said, my voice firm, "is there something you need? Why do you keep coming here?" He stared at me for a long moment before shaking his head slowly. "Ain't been here before," he muttered, his voice low and raspy. Then he turned and walked off again, disappearing into the woods. His words stuck with me. He'd definitely been there before. I'd seen him 3 nights in a row. Was he lying? Maybe he was messing with me. I didn't know, but the whole thing was starting to freak me out. I locked the cabin door that night, something I hadn't done before. The next evening, I didn't go outside. I stayed inside the cabin, peeking up through the window. Sure enough, as the sun started to set, he appeared again. This time he was standing right at the edge of the porch. He was closer than ever, just staring at the cabin. I stayed hidden, heart pounding in my chest, watching in through the small crack in the curtains. He didn't move for what felt like hours. Then, just like before, he turned and walked away into the woods. The following morning, I decided I had enough. I wasn't going to stay here for the full week. It was getting too weird. I called the rental agency and told them about the guy. They said no one lived nearby and that it was unusual for anyone to be on the property. They offered to send someone out to check, but I declined. I didn't want to make a big deal of it, and I was planning on leaving early anyway. That evening, I was packing my bags when I heard something outside. I looked through the window and there he was, standing in the same spot as before. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were 2 more men with him, standing just behind him in the shadows. They were all staring at the cabin. Panic set in. I grabbed my keys and my bag, ready to leave right then and there. But as I stepped outside, they were gone. I looked around, scanning the tree line, but there was no one in sight. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, watching. I could feel it. My heart was racing as I got into the car and started the engine. As I drove down the narrow road leading away from the cabin, I kept checking my rearview mirror. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The road was empty, but every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the trees, like shadows darting between the trunks. I made it to the nearest town and checked into a small motel for the night. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. It felt too strange to explain. I didn't even know what to say. Who were those men? Why were they watching me? The next morning, I drove back to the cabin to grab the rest of my things. I was nervous, but I figured it would be safe in the daylight. When I arrived, the cabin looked just as I had left it, but there was something new. There were markings on the windows, strange symbols scratched into the glass. They hadn't been there before. I didn't stay to investigate. I grabbed my remaining stuff, locked up, and left for good. I told the rental agency what I had seen, but they didn't seem too concerned. They said no one else had reported anything unusual. It was like they didn't believe me. I don't know who those men were or what they wanted, but I've never felt so watched, so vulnerable. I arrived at the house in the late afternoon. The drive had been long, and I was looking forward to just relaxing. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, and the photos of the Airbnb looked perfect, cozy, isolated, and close to nature. I parked in the gravel driveway and got out, stretching my legs. The house was old, but well kept, a two-story cottage with a white picket fence. I found the key under the mat, just like the host had said, and let myself inside. The place smelled a little musty, but I figured that was normal for a house in the woods. It was clean, though, and everything seemed to be in order. I dropped my bag near the door and took a look around. The furniture looked just like the photos, though some of it seemed a bit older than I expected. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a staircase leading upstairs to what I assumed were the bedrooms. It had that lived-in feeling, which was comforting in a way. After unpacking a bit, I noticed a few things that seemed off. The first thing was a framed photo on the mantel above the fireplace. It was an old family portrait, a man, a woman, and 2 children. I didn't think much of it at first, but something about it nagged at me. The Airbnb listing hadn't mentioned anything about a family living here recently. The place was supposed to be used just for rentals, but this picture made it seem like someone still lived here. I shrugged it off and went to the kitchen to make some tea. That's when I noticed the second odd thing. There were dishes in the sink. Not just a couple, but a stack of them. They were clean, but they definitely hadn't been put away. Again, I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Maybe the cleaners just forgot to finish the job. I'd send a message to the host later. As the evening wore on, I settled in with a book and tried to relax. But there was a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. I decided to check my email to see if the host had left any last-minute instructions. That's when I saw it, a message from the Airbnb host, sent just an hour ago. "Hi, just confirming your stay. You should have arrived by now. If you have any issues, let me know. I won't be available tonight after 9 p.m., but feel free to reach out before then." I stared at the screen. The message didn't match up with the check-in instructions I had received before. I hadn't spoken to the host since booking the place a few weeks ago. I looked back at the listing details to compare, and that's when I noticed something strange. The address on the listing didn't match the one I was at. It was close, just a few numbers off, but enough to make me realize I was in the wrong place. Panic started to set in. I had been here for hours, thinking this was the right house. But whose house was this? I quickly grabbed my phone and called the number the host had provided, but it went straight to voicemail. I hung up and tried again, my hands shaking. Still no answer. I looked around the room, the family photo suddenly feeling much more ominous. The realization that I was in someone else's home hit me hard. I thought about leaving right then, but it was already dark outside, and the house was in the middle of nowhere. I didn't even know where the real Airbnb was. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that it was just an honest mistake that I could explain if anyone showed up. But then I heard a car pulling into the driveway. My heart stopped. I crept to the window and peeked out, seeing headlights cutting through the trees. The car was old, a beat-up sedan, and it parked right behind mine, blocking me in. The engine cut off, and I saw two people inside, a man and a woman. They sat there for a moment, talking, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. Then the man got out, his silhouette dark against the porch light. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Should I hide? Try to explain? My stomach twisted with fear as I heard the front door handle rattle. The door didn't open, though it was still locked. But then I heard keys jingling, and I realized with horror that they had their own set. They were the owners. I ran upstairs, my footsteps quiet, hoping they wouldn't hear. I didn't know what to do. I could hear the door open now, their voices low as they stepped inside. The woman said something I couldn't make out, but her tone wasn't happy. I ducked into the first bedroom I found, closing the door softly behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could hear them moving around downstairs, talking, but I couldn't make out the words. The tension in the air was suffocating. What would they do when they realized a stranger had been in their house? I tried to think of an excuse, something that would make sense, but nothing sounded believable. How could I explain being in someone's home by mistake for hours? The footsteps grew louder as they moved closer to the stairs. I knew they would come up soon, and when they did, they would find me. My mind raced. Maybe I could sneak out, get to my car and leave before they saw me. I cracked the bedroom door open and peeked out. The hallway was empty, but I could hear them coming up the stairs now. My pulse quickened. I moved as quietly as I could, slipping out of the room and heading toward the back of the house. There was a window at the end of the hall, and I prayed it wasn't locked. I reached the window just as the man stepped onto the landing. His voice was calm, too calm. "Hello?" he called out, his tone chilling. I froze for a second, but then I forced myself to move. I fumbled with the window latch, my hands shaking. The woman's voice followed, asking him something in a low tone. I pushed the window open just as I heard footsteps heading down the hall. They were coming straight for me. Without thinking, I climbed out the window, dropping to the ground below. I landed hard, pain shooting up my legs, but I didn't stop. I ran around the side of the house, my heart pounding in my ears. I could still hear them inside, but they hadn't seen me yet. I reached my car and yanked the door open, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, backing out of the driveway as fast as I could. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man standing on the porch, watching me with a cold, unreadable expression. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, shaking all over. I parked at a gas station and just sat there for a while, trying to calm down. I never went back to the house. I rented a cabin out by a lake last fall, thinking it would be a quiet getaway. The place was small, just one room with a bed and a kitchenette. It was nothing fancy, but that was the point. I needed the quiet, the space to think, to just be away from everything for a bit. The lake was completely still, and there were only a few other cabins nearby, scattered around the water. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent the days hiking around the area, reading, just trying to clear my head. There was another cabin across the lake from mine, probably a couple 100 yards away. It looked abandoned, overgrown, shutters hanging loose, the dock falling apart. I didn't think much of it. On the third night, I noticed a light flickering over there. It caught my eye as I was sitting on the porch, watching the sun go down. It wasn't like someone had turned on a lamp or anything. It was more like a flashlight, maybe, or a candle, just blinking on and off. It was strange because I hadn't seen anyone there since I arrived, and the place didn't look like it was in any shape to be lived in. I told myself it was probably just some kids messing around. I had no reason to think otherwise, but still, something about it made me uneasy. The light would flicker for a while, then go out completely, only to come back a few minutes later. It kept doing that, on and off, until I finally went inside for the night. The next day, I walked around the lake, figuring I'd go check it out. I wasn't scared, just curious. The path was overgrown, but I found my way to the other side easily enough. The closer I got to the cabin, the more rundown it looked. The roof had caved in on one side, and there were weeds growing up through the cracks in the porch. When I got up to the front door, I noticed it was slightly open. Not much, just a crack, but enough to make me pause. I thought about turning around right then, but I didn't. Instead, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The place was a mess. Furniture was overturned, the floor covered in dust and leaves that had blown in through broken windows. But what caught my attention was the table in the center of the room. It was clear, no dust, no debris. Someone had been here recently. I walked over to it, and that's when I saw the candle. It was burned down to almost nothing, the wax pooled on the table. It wasn't an old candle either. It had been used recently, probably the night before. Next to it was a pack of matches, one of them still half burned. I stood there for a minute, trying to make sense of it. There was no sign of anyone living here, no food, no clothes, nothing to suggest someone had been staying here. Just that candle and the matches. I stepped back outside, feeling more unsettled than I wanted to admit. As I stood on the porch, I looked back at my own cabin across the lake. It was so quiet, so still, and for a moment, I felt completely alone, even though I knew there were other people in the area. That light flickering all night suddenly felt a lot more sinister. I headed back to my cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, though there was no one. That night, the light across the lake flickered again, just like before. This time, I watched it longer. The pattern was strange, almost deliberate. It wasn't random, like a faulty light or someone casually moving around. It blinked on and off in short bursts, like someone signaling something. I tried to convince myself it was just some local kids, or maybe even a reflection from something else, but deep down, I didn't believe that. Something about it felt too deliberate. The next day, I debated going back, but I couldn't bring myself to. I spent the day in my cabin, but I couldn't focus on anything. My eyes kept drifting to that cabin across the water. The flickering didn't start again until the sun went down, but when it did, it felt even more eerie. Like it was waiting for me to notice. I decided to stay inside that night, but I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that light flashing in the darkness. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, like I'd been watched all night. I knew it was just in my head, but it didn't make the feeling go away. I made some coffee and sat on the porch, trying to shake off the tension. That's when I saw the footprints. They were on the edge of the lake, right near the water. They hadn't been there the day before, and they weren't mine. Someone had walked around the lake, right up to the water's edge, and stood there. Watching, maybe. I got up and walked closer to the water. The prints were clear, leading from the woods down to the shore, then stopping. Whoever had been there hadn't crossed the lake, but they had stood there for a while, looking across at my cabin. I felt sick to my stomach. That night, the light didn't flicker. The cabin across the lake was dark, but that didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it made me feel worse, like something was building, waiting. I kept the curtains closed, but I couldn't stop myself from peeking out every few minutes, half expecting to see someone standing outside. The hours dragged on, and every little sound made me jump. The creak of the wind, the rustle of leaves, all of it set my nerves on edge. Then, just after midnight, I heard something, a knock on the door. It was quiet, almost hesitant, but it was definitely a knock. My heart started racing. I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, listening. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. I waited, my hand on the doorknob, unsure of what to do. The knock came a third time, and this time it was hard, demanding. I stepped back, my mind racing. Whoever was out there wanted me to open the door, but I wasn't going to. I sat down in the dark, my back against the wall, and waited. The knocking stopped after a few minutes, but the tension didn't. I stayed awake all night, listening for any sound, but nothing happened. In the morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't care about the rest of my reservation. I wasn't going to stay there another night. As I drove away, I looked back at the cabin across the lake one last time. The shutters were closed, the dock empty, but I could have sworn I saw someone standing in the window, watching me leave. I rented a small cabin in the woods for a weekend. It was far from anything, just the way I wanted. I needed time away, to relax, to not think about work or life for a few days. The place was isolated, miles from the nearest town. It had this old, worn charm about it, tucked away behind thick trees. There was no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just me and the quiet. The first day was peaceful. I spent most of it outside, sitting on the porch, listening to the birds, the wind through the trees. In the evening, I built a fire in the little stove and read by the light of an old lamp. It felt good to be away from everything. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The second day, just before noon, a man came by. He knocked on the door, and I was surprised because I hadn't seen anyone around since I arrived. He introduced himself as Tom, said he lived about a mile down the road. He seemed friendly enough, maybe a little too friendly, but I didn't think much of it at first. He told me he noticed someone new at the cabin and just wanted to check in, make sure I was settling in all right. We chatted for a few minutes. He asked if I needed anything, offered to show me around the area. I thanked him but said I was just here to relax. He smiled, said he understood, then left. I thought that would be the end of it. That evening, just as it was getting dark, there was another knock at the door. It was Tom again. This time, he had a flashlight in his hand and said he was just passing by, making sure I was okay. It felt a little odd, but I didn't want to be rude. He stood on the porch for a few minutes, asking me how my day was, if I'd seen any wildlife. His questions felt more like small talk than anything else, but there was something about the way he lingered that made me uneasy. He asked if I had locked all the doors and windows, said it was a good idea out here. I told him I had, but he kept insisting I double-check. He offered to walk around the cabin with me, make sure everything was secure. I politely declined, told him I could handle it. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stayed a few minutes longer than he should have, then finally left. That night, I couldn't sleep as well. Every little sound outside made me sit up and listen. I kept thinking about the way Tom had stood there, just a little too close, his eyes watching me like he wasn't really listening to what I was saying. The next day, I stayed inside more. I didn't feel like going out, and I kept glancing at the road, half expecting to see him walking up again. By afternoon, I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just being neighborly, a little too eager to help. It wasn't until late that night that I realized how wrong I was. It was past 10 when I heard the knock. I froze for a second, my heart racing. I knew it was him. I didn't want to answer, but I felt like I had to. When I opened the door, there he was, smiling again, holding that same flashlight. He said he noticed the lights on and wanted to make sure I was okay. I lied and said I was just about to go to bed, hoping he'd take the hint. Instead, he asked if he could come in for a minute. I didn't know what to say. I didn't want him inside, but I also didn't want to make him angry. Reluctantly, I stepped aside and let him in. He walked around the cabin, commenting on how cozy it was, how it reminded him of his own place. He looked at everything, like he was inspecting it. Then he asked again if I'd checked all the locks. I told him I had, but he walked over to the back door and tried the knob, like he didn't believe me. I was starting to feel trapped. I didn't know how to get him to leave without making things worse. He kept finding reasons to stay, asking questions about my trip, offering tips about the area. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. He wasn't just being friendly anymore. He was testing me, pushing to see how far he could go. Finally, I told him I was tired and needed to sleep. He hesitated for a moment, then smiled that same strange smile and said goodnight. I locked the door behind him and listened as his footsteps faded down the path. but I couldn't relax. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't really gone. I checked the locks again, every window, every door. I even pulled a chair in front of the door, just in case. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't help it. Something about him just wasn't right. The next morning, I woke up early, anxious to leave. I packed my things quickly, ready to get out of there before Tom showed up again. But just as I was about to load my bags into the car, I saw him coming up the road. My heart sank. He waved and called out, saying he brought some breakfast. I forced a smile, trying to act like I wasn't in a rush. He walked up, holding a paper bag, and asked if I'd like to sit and eat with him. I told him I couldn't, that I had to leave. I hoped he'd understand, but his smile faded, and he just stood there, staring at me for a second. Then, almost too casually, he asked why I was leaving so soon. I stammered something about needing to get back for work. I could tell he didn't believe me. He kept standing there, blocking my way to the car, like he was waiting for me to change my mind. I felt trapped again, like I had no way out. I forced another smile and told him I appreciated his hospitality, but I really had to go. He finally stepped aside, but I could feel his eyes on me as I loaded my bags into the car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, watching me, his face unreadable. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that cabin, from those woods, from him. Even then, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see his truck following me down the road. I never went back to that cabin, and I never will. Something about him, the way he kept coming back, the way he pushed his way into my space, it wasn't right. I woke up in the middle of the night, not really sure what had disturbed me at first. I sat up in bed and listened for a while, thinking maybe it was just the wind or some animal outside. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, right on the porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I live alone in a small house out in the country, so hearing something like that isn't normal. The nearest neighbor is half a mile away, and nobody just comes by this time of night. I lay there for a few seconds, frozen, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an animal. But animals don't walk like that. They don't take slow, careful steps, like someone trying not to be noticed. I grabbed a baseball bat I keep by the bed and crept toward the front door. The sound had stopped by the time I got close, so I took a deep breath and opened the door a crack, just enough to peek out. The porch light flickered dimly, but there was no one there. I stepped outside, looking around the yard. Nothing. The grass was still, and the night was silent, too silent. I stood there for a while, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but all I heard was my own heartbeat. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat on the couch for a long time, too jittery to go back to bed. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The day passed without incident. I went about my usual routine, trying to forget about what had happened the night before. I convinced myself that maybe it had been a stray dog or something, even though I knew that wasn't true. As night fell again, though, the unease started creeping back in. I didn't sleep much that night, just laid in bed, listening for any noise. And sure enough, sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were closer. It sounded like they were right up against the front door. I sat up in bed, gripping the bat so tightly my hands hurt. I waited, listening to the sound of someone or something pacing back and forth on the porch. The steps were heavier this time, more confident, as if whoever it was knew I was awake and listening. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't dare move. After what felt like forever, the footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing, straining to hear any movement. But there was nothing, just silence again. I stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to go outside, too afraid to even look out the window. This became a pattern over the next few nights. I'd go to bed, try to sleep, and then, in the dead of night, the footsteps would return. Each time, they got closer, bolder. They lingered longer. Whoever it was never knocked, never tried to get in, just paced outside like they were waiting for something. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I was going to confront whoever it was. I stayed up, sitting by the front door with a bat in my lap, waiting. When the footsteps started, I jumped up and threw open the door. There was no one there. The porch was empty, just like before. But I knew I'd heard something. The sound of footsteps had been so clear, right on the other side of the door. My skin crawled. I stepped out onto the porch again, looking around the yard, the woods surrounding the house. It was dark, too dark. The moon barely lit anything, and the shadows seemed to stretch out forever. I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed a chair up against it. I sat there the rest of the night, not moving, barely blinking. The footsteps didn't come back that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. The next day, I called the local sheriff's office. I told them what had been happening, but they didn't seem too concerned. Probably just some kids messing around, they said. They promised to send someone out to patrol the area, but that didn't make me feel any better. That night, I tried to stay calm, tried to tell myself it was all in my head. But I couldn't sleep, not really. I kept listening, waiting for the footsteps to start again. And they did. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled the house, slowly, methodically. I could hear them moving from the front door to the windows, stopping just long enough for me to imagine someone standing there, peering in. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound to go away. But it didn't. It went on for hours. I don't know how I made it through that night, but when the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, the footsteps finally stopped. I knew I couldn't stay in the house another night. I packed a bag, planning to leave for a few days, let things settle down. But as I loaded up the car, I had the horrible feeling that someone was watching me. I looked around, but I didn't see anything. Still, the sensation wouldn't go away. It was like eyes were on me, from the woods, from the shadows, from somewhere I couldn't see. I drove into town and stayed at a motel that night. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just needed to get away, needed to sleep without the sound of footsteps echoing in my ears. But even in the motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally returned to the house a few days later, everything seemed normal. No signs of anyone having been there, no footprints on the porch, no damage to the windows or doors. It was like the whole thing had never happened. But I knew better. I could still feel it, that uneasy tension in the air, like someone was just out of sight, watching and waiting. That night, the footsteps came again. They were louder, more deliberate. They stopped right at the front door, and then, for the first time, there was a knock. Just one. Soft, but firm. I didn't move, didn't answer. The knocking came again, this time a little louder, more insistent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I waited, praying it would stop, but the knocking continued. I knew I couldn't open the door, but I also knew I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whoever was on the other side. I crept over to the door, holding my breath, and looked through the peephole. There was nothing. The porch was empty. But the knocking kept coming, steady, deliberate. I backed away from the door, grabbed my car keys, and ran out the back. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back in my car, speeding away from the house. I never went back. I couldn't. I had rented a small cabin up in the mountains for a weekend, hoping for some peace and quiet. I needed a break from everything, just a few days to clear my head. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, and I had planned on doing some hiking while I was there. The trails weren't well marked, but I figured I wouldn't stray too far, just enough to enjoy the fresh air and some solitude. On the second day, I set out in the early afternoon. The sun was still high, so I wasn't worried about getting lost or anything. I had my phone, and even though the signal was spotty, I thought I could find my way back without any trouble. I walked for about an hour, just following a narrow path that wound through the trees. It was quiet, except for the occasional sound of birds or the rustling of leaves in the wind. I was starting to think about turning back when I heard voices up ahead. At first, I thought it was other hikers, maybe a group just enjoying the woods like I was. But as I got closer, I realized something wasn't right. The voices were low, hushed, and there was an edge to them, like they were arguing or trying to keep quiet. I slowed down and crept forward until I could see through the trees. There were 4 men standing in a small clearing. They weren't dressed like hikers, though they had rifles slung over their shoulders and a pile of something at their feet. I squinted, trying to see what it was, and then I realized it was a deer. A dead one, freshly killed, with blood pooling in the grass. They were clearly hunting, but I knew this wasn't a hunting season, and something about the whole scene felt wrong. I must have made a noise because one of the men suddenly looked up in my direction. Our eyes met, and for a second, I froze. I didn't know what to do. My instinct was to turn and run, but I knew that would draw more attention. Instead, I stepped back, trying to move quietly, but my foot caught on a root, and I stumbled. The noise echoed through the trees, and now all 4 of them were looking right at me. One of them, a tall guy with a scruffy beard, said something to the others, and they all started walking toward me. I turned and started walking quickly back the way I came, trying not to break into a full sprint. My heart was pounding, and I could hear them behind me, their footsteps getting closer. They weren't calling out or anything, just following, and that's what scared me the most. If they had just wanted to tell me to leave whether I was on private land, they would have said something. But they didn't. I kept moving, trying to stay calm, but I could hear them getting closer. One of them called out, "Hey, way up," in a voice that didn't sound friendly. I ignored it and kept walking faster. I knew the trail was ahead, but it felt like I wasn't getting any closer to it. I could feel their eyes on me, and I started to panic. Then, I heard one of them say, "She's gonna tell someone," and that was all I needed to hear. I broke into a run, not caring about the noise I was making now. I just needed to get away. I could hear them running after me, their boots crashing through the underbrush. I didn't dare look back. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I kept running. The trail finally came into view, and I veered onto it, hoping they would stop chasing me once I was back on the main path. But they didn't. I could still hear them behind me, not as close as before, but close enough that I couldn't stop. I didn't know how long I could keep running, but I knew I couldn't let them catch up. I kept going, the trees blurring past me as I sprinted down the trail. I didn't know where I was headed, but anywhere was better than staying near those men. I could still hear them, but they seemed to be falling behind. Maybe they weren't as familiar with the trail, or maybe they thought I'd tire out soon. Either way, I didn't slow down. After what felt like forever, I saw the cabin through the trees. I ran straight for it, fumbling with the door as I tried to get my keys out. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped them, but I managed to get the door open and slammed it behind me, locking it with trembling fingers. I stood there, listening for any sign that they had followed me all the way back, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. I didn't dare look out the window, afraid of what I might see. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, praying that I had enough of a signal to get through. The operator picked up, and I tried to explain what had happened, my words tumbling over each other. They said they'd send someone out, but it would take time. There weren't any officers nearby. I hung up and sat down on the floor, trying to calm down, but every little sound outside made me jump. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting for someone to show up. Finally, I heard the sound of a car pulling up, and I peeked out the window to see a sheriff's vehicle. I ran outside, practically throwing myself at the deputy, trying to explain everything that had happened. They searched the area but didn't find the men. They told me that poaching wasn't uncommon in these parts, but they'd never heard of anyone getting violent over it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I hadn't run, if I hadn't gotten away when I did, something much worse would have happened. I packed up and left the cabin the next morning. I didn't care about getting a refund or staying the rest of the weekend. I just wanted to be as far away from those woods as possible. I had rented the cabin for a quiet weekend, some time away from the city, but I didn't plan on getting snowed in. The blizzard came out of nowhere. By late afternoon, the wind was howling, and snow was piling up against the windows. I had enough food, and the cabin had a fireplace, so I figured I'd just ride it out. I wasn't too worried at first. It was sometime after midnight when I first heard the knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling something, but the sound was too steady. It was 3 slow knocks, followed by a pause, and then 3 more. I waited, thinking maybe I'd imagined it, but there it was again. The same pattern. I got up and went to the door. There's a small window next to it, so I peeked through. It was dark outside, and all I could see was snow blowing around. I almost turned away when I saw him. There was a man standing just outside the porch light, barely visible through the storm. He was hunched over, his face mostly hidden by a hood. I could only make out his mouth and the lower half of his face. "Hey," he called out. His voice sounded muffled by the wind. "I need help." I hesitated. I wasn't sure how he could have made it this far into the storm. The roads were buried, and the nearest house was miles away. But there he was, just standing there, looking like he was freezing. Something felt off, but I couldn't just leave him out there, could I? I opened the door a crack, keeping the chain on. "What do you need?" I asked. "I'm lost," he said. "Can I come in?" Just for a minute, to warm up. His voice didn't match his face. It was too calm, too steady for someone who had supposedly been wandering through a blizzard. I couldn't explain it, but the way he asked made my skin crawl. He didn't sound desperate. He sounded rehearsed. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said, still keeping the door mostly shut. "Please," he said, taking a step closer. "I just need to warm up for a bit." I glanced behind him. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that he had walked up to the cabin. The snow was undisturbed, completely smooth, except where he was standing. That didn't make any sense. "How did you get here?" I asked. "I was driving and my car slid off the road," he said. "I've been walking for hours." I couldn't see any car tracks either. There was nothing. My hand tightened on the doorknob. Something wasn't right about this guy. Everything about him felt wrong, like he didn't belong out there in the storm. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I can't let you in." The man's smile dropped. For a second, he just stared at me, not saying anything. Then he reached out and grabbed the doorknob, pulling at it hard enough to make the chain rattle. "Let me in," he said, his voice low and flat now. "It's freezing out here." My heart was pounding. I slammed the door shut and locked it, backing away quickly. The knocking started again, louder this time, but more insistent. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but when I looked at the screen, there was no signal. No bars, nothing. I ran over to the landline on the kitchen counter, but it was dead too. The storm must have taken down the lines. I was completely cut off. The knocking kept going, louder and louder. I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen drawer and backed up against the far wall, staring at the door. He wasn't saying anything anymore, just knocking, over and over. I could hear the wind howling outside, but underneath it, I could hear his voice, low and steady, repeating the same words, "Let me in." It felt like hours before the knocking finally stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I stood there, listening, but I couldn't hear anything outside anymore. I wanted to believe he was gone, but I didn't dare check. I stayed there, gripping the knife, staring at the door, until my legs ached from standing. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I moved to the bedroom and locked the door behind me. I could still hear the wind outside, but nothing else. No more knocking. No more voices. I told myself he had left, that he had given up and gone to find shelter somewhere else. But I didn't sleep. In the morning, the storm had calmed down. I forced myself to go to the front door and look outside. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The snow was completely undisturbed. I packed up and left as soon as the roads were cleared enough to drive. I didn't care if my weekend was cut short. Something had been up there in the storm, and whatever it wasn't a man lost in the snow. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. A quiet weekend at an off-grid cabin seemed like the perfect escape. No phone service, no distractions, just a few days to read, hike, and clear my mind. It was tucked away in the woods, far from the nearest town, and completely isolated. The first night had gone smoothly. The fireplace kept the cabin warm, and I spent the evening reading by lantern light before going to bed early. Everything was peaceful. The second night, though, something changed. It was around midnight when the power went out. 1 second, I was sitting on the couch with a blanket, listening to the wind outside, and the next, the lights flickered and went out completely. The heater clicked off too, and suddenly the cabin felt cold. I wasn't too worried at first. Being so far out, I figured it could just be a typical power cut. It was an old cabin, after all, and the wiring might have been faulty. I got up, feeling my way through the dark to find the flashlight I'd brought with me. When I flicked it on, the beam cut through the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls. I went to the breaker box near the back door. Maybe it had just tripped, I thought. I opened the box and looked inside, but everything seemed fine. No switches had flipped. That was when a strange feeling crept over me. I glanced out the small window by the door. The wind had died down, and everything outside was still, but there was something unsettling about the silence. I didn't see anything, just the black outline of the trees and the moonlight reflecting off the snow. But it felt like someone was watching me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I decided to check the generator outside. It wasn't too far from the cabin, just a few steps out the back. I grabbed my coat and boots, pulled them on, and stepped out into the cold. The air was freezing, biting at my face, and the snow crunched under my feet as I walked toward the generator. The flashlight beam bounced in front of me, and that's when I saw it. The generator cover had been lifted, and the cables were cut clean through. It wasn't an accident. Someone had done it on purpose. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the wires. My mind raced, trying to process what I was looking at. The cables hadn't frayed, hadn't worn out. They'd been cut. Someone had been here. Someone had done this. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one in sight. Just the empty woods, the trees standing tall and dark, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. I was alone, at least I thought I was. But if someone had cut the power, they couldn't be far. I hurried back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. My breathing was shallow, and I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a prank, I told myself. Maybe some kids messing around. But it didn't feel like a prank. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. I tried my phone, but of course, there was no signal. No landline either. My only option was to wait it out until morning, when I could drive to the nearest town and call for help. I glanced at the clock, barely past midnight. I had hours to go. I moved a chair to block the door and sat there with my flashlight, waiting. Every little sound made me jump, the creak of the cabin, the wind rattling the window panes, the branches tapping against the roof. My mind kept playing tricks on me, imagining shadows moving outside, footsteps crunching in the snow. Then there was a real noise. A soft knock on the window. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned the flashlight toward the window, shining it through the glass. Nothing. Just the empty night, the snow still falling gently outside. But I heard it. I know I had. I sat there, gripping the flashlight tightly, barely breathing. Minutes passed, then another knock, this time at the back door. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode. Someone was out there, circling the cabin, knocking just to let me know they were there. Playing with me. The knocking moved again, this time to the front door. Then the windows, tapping softly but deliberately. They were everywhere, and I couldn't see them, but they knew I was inside. I felt trapped, like a rabbit in a cage, and I didn't know what to do. If I stayed inside, they could break in. But if I went out there, I had no idea who or what I was facing. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. It was like waiting for the other shoe to drop, knowing something was coming but not when. My eyes kept darting around, my hands trembling. Then, I heard the doorknob turn. Just a soft click, like someone testing it, seeing if I had forgotten to lock it. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight tighter. Whoever it was stood there for a long moment, then I heard footsteps moving away, back into the snow. I didn't relax. I didn't move from that chair for the rest of the night, keeping the flashlight pointed at the door, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, I packed my things, shoved them into the car, and didn't look back. I didn't even bother trying to figure out who had been out there or why they had cut the power. I just drove, not stopping until I was far away from that cabin, back in the safety of the nearest town. Whatever had happened, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was looking forward to some quiet time alone in the woods. I rented this small cabin for the weekend, just me and the trees, away from everything. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. It was perfect, or so I thought. I got there around noon, parked the car, and started to unpack. The weather was clear, the woods were quiet, and everything seemed normal. I took a short hike that afternoon to get familiar with the area. The trail was barely used, just a narrow dirt path cutting through the thick trees. About an hour into the walk, I saw another hiker coming toward me from the opposite direction. He was older, maybe in his late 40s, wearing an old, worn-out jacket. He didn't look like someone who was just out for a casual hike. As we got closer, he stopped and looked at me for a moment. Then, without much of a greeting, he said, "You shouldn't be here. This area isn't safe, especially not after dark." I wasn't sure if he was messing with me or if he really meant it. His voice was flat, serious. I asked him why, but he just shook his head. "Just leave before nightfall," he said, then walked past me, continuing down the trail without looking back. It was a weird encounter, but I shrugged it off. I figured he was just some local trying to scare off tourists. I wasn't going to let it ruin my weekend. I turned around and headed back to the cabin. By the time I got there, it was late afternoon. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. I settled in for the evening, cooking some dinner and lighting a fire in the small fireplace. The cabin was cozy, and I felt pretty relaxed. I kept thinking about the man on the trail, though. His words kept replaying in my mind. Leave before nightfall. What did he mean by that? I tried to push it out of my head, but it lingered there, gnawing at me. Around 8 p.m., it started to get really dark. Out here, there were no streetlights or house lights in the distance, just pure darkness surrounding the cabin. I hadn't planned on going outside again, but I decided to step out for a minute to get some air. As soon as I opened the door, I felt it. The air was colder than it had been all day, and the woods were too quiet. No wind, no animals, just complete silence. I stood there for a minute, looking out into the trees, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like the forest was watching me. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but I didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake that uneasy feeling, so I went back inside and locked the door. I sat down by the fire, trying to distract myself with a book, but every little sound outside caught my attention. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, it all seemed too close. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see something, but the darkness was too thick. The cabin's small windows didn't offer much of a view anyway. Just blackness beyond the glass. Then, I heard a soft tapping at the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, listening, but it didn't happen again. I told myself it was just the wind, even though there hadn't been any wind all night. Still, I got up and looked through the window, shining my flashlight outside. Nothing. Just the trees and the empty trail leading into the woods. I sat back down, trying to calm down, but it happened again. This time it wasn't a tap, it was a knock. Slow and deliberate. I jumped up, my pulse racing. I went to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was there. I backed away, suddenly feeling very alone and very exposed. The knock came again, louder this time, from the back of the cabin. It sounded like someone was walking around outside, testing the windows and doors. I grabbed the flashlight and ran to the back window, but there was still nothing. The woods were empty. I thought about the man from earlier. Maybe he was trying to scare me, to mess with me for not taking his warning seriously. Or maybe it was someone else. I didn't know what to think, but the fear was real. I tried to call someone, anyone, but of course, there was no signal this deep in the woods. For the next hour, I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, listening. The footsteps outside came and went, circling the cabin. Each time, they stopped for a while, and then they'd start up again. It felt like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there, but didn't want to show themselves. I tried to stay calm, but every minute that passed made it harder. I locked the door, pulled the curtain shut, and turned off the lights, hoping to make it look like I wasn't there. Maybe they'd leave me alone if they thought the cabin was empty. But the knocking didn't stop. It moved around the cabin, slowly, deliberately. Tap. 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 Like they were waiting for me to come out or make a move. At some point, the knocking stopped completely. It was so sudden that it was almost worse. The silence pressed down on me, making my skin crawl. I didn't dare move. I sat there in the dark, staring at the door, waiting. Then, I heard it. A voice. Quiet and low, just outside the door. "Come out," it said. "Come outside." It was the same voice as the man from the trail. My blood went cold. I knew it wasn't a trick of my mind. Someone was really there, trying to lure me out. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, praying that they'd leave. Minutes passed. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Finally, the voice faded, and I heard footsteps crunching through the snow, moving away from the cabin. I waited, heart racing, until I couldn't hear anything at all. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, listening, just waiting for the sound of footsteps to return. But they never did. When the sun finally came up, I packed my things and left without looking back. I had been looking forward to this cabin rental for weeks. It was supposed to be a relaxing escape from my hectic life. The cabin was nestled in a quiet area with beautiful views of the surrounding mountains. It seemed perfect when I arrived, clean, well-kept, and isolated enough to feel private. The first day was everything I hoped for. I spent the morning hiking, then enjoyed a peaceful afternoon reading on the porch. The tranquility was exactly what I needed. That night, I slept soundly, lulled by the silence of the woods. On the second day, I decided to take a closer look around the cabin. It was bigger than it had seemed in the pictures, with several rooms and a cozy living area. I began exploring, just to get a better feel for the place. While I went into the master bedroom, I noticed something strange. The closet door was slightly ajar, and there was a small black device on the shelf. At first, I thought it was some kind of alarm or remote control. I picked it up and examined it, but it had no obvious labels or buttons. Curiosity got the better of me, so I turned it over. That's when I saw the small lens hidden in the corner. It dawned on me that it might be a camera. I checked around the room more carefully and found another small device tucked behind a lamp on the nightstand. My heart started racing. I immediately went to check the other rooms. In the guest room, I found a similar setup with a camera hidden behind a painting on the wall. My anxiety grew with each new discovery. There was a camera in the living area too, hidden inside a fake smoke detector on the ceiling. I felt sick. I had trusted this place, and now I realized that my privacy had been completely invaded. I tried to stay calm and think logically. I knew I had to leave and report this to the authorities. I gathered my things quickly, trying to act as normal as possible, but my mind was spinning. As I was heading toward the door, I saw a car pull up outside. It was the cabin owner. He had arrived unexpectedly. Panic surged through me. I didn't want to confront him, but I also didn't want to stay any longer. I decided to go outside and explain that I needed to leave. As I stepped out, he greeted me with a warm smile. "Everything all right?" he asked. I tried to keep my voice steady as I told him I had just realized I needed to cut my stay short. He seemed confused but nodded. "Sure, no problem. Is there anything I can help with?" His friendliness felt forced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't want to say too much. I just wanted to get away. As I loaded my car, I saw him watching me from the porch. I felt his eyes on my back as I worked quickly, trying to stay calm despite my fear. When I was almost done packing, he came over to me. "I just want to make sure you're okay," he said, looking genuinely concerned. "Is everything all right with the cabin?" I hesitated, then decided to be straightforward. "I found cameras in the cabin. I'm not comfortable staying here anymore." His expression changed in an instant. The concern melted away, replaced by something I couldn't quite place. "Cameras?" he asked, his voice cold. "There must be a misunderstanding." I was about to reply when he suddenly stepped closer. "Let me show you something," he said. "I assure you, there's no reason to be alarmed." I felt a chill run down my spine. I had to decide quickly. I told him I didn't want to see anything and that I was leaving. I tried to get into my car, but he moved to block my path. He raised his hands as if to calm me. "Please, just hear me out. The cameras are for security. There's nothing to worry about." I backed away, shaking my head. "No, I'm not staying. I'm calling the police." I reached for my phone, but he grabbed my arm. His grip was firm but not violent. "You don't need to do that," he said. "This is all a misunderstanding. I can explain everything." I pulled free and got into my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I saw him standing there, watching, as I started the engine. I didn't dare look back as I drove away, my heart pounding. I made it to the nearest town and contacted the authorities. They took my report seriously and promised to investigate. Later that day, I learned that the cabin owner had been reported for similar incidents before. It seemed I wasn't the first to discover something troubling in one of his properties. I never went back to that cabin or any of his other rentals. The experience left me shaken, but I was relieved to have left when I did. I decided to take a solo trip to clear my head. It had been a stressful few months at work, and I needed a break from everything. I booked a cabin in the woods, far away from the noise and people. It was supposed to be just a weekend, some time to hike, read, and relax. I didn't expect anything strange to happen. The cabin was small but comfortable. It had everything I needed, a bed, a small kitchen, and a fireplace. It was isolated, tucked deep into the forest. There wasn't anyone around for miles, which was exactly what I wanted. The air was crisp, and the trees were thick. The only sounds were the wind and the occasional bird. I arrived in the afternoon and spent some time unpacking and settling in. I was planning to take a hike before dinner, so I grabbed my backpack and set out on one of the trails behind the cabin. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. The sun was starting to set, so I decided to head back. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. Just outside the cabin, near the tree line, was a small camping setup. It looked like someone had left their gear there, a tent, a backpack, and some supplies. but I hadn't seen anyone all day, and this cabin was supposed to be private. There shouldn't have been anyone else around. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the gear. It didn't make sense. Maybe someone had gotten lost or set up camp nearby. I looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. I thought about calling out, but something about the situation felt off. I decided to ignore it for now and went inside to make dinner. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Why would someone leave their gear so close to the cabin? And where were they? I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see someone walking up to the door. But no one came. I went to bed early, hoping to get some rest. But around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It sounded like shuffling, like someone was moving around outside the cabin. My heart started racing. I lay there for a moment, listening. The noise stopped. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. I couldn't see much in the dark, but something was definitely off. The camping gear that had been near the tree line earlier was now closer to the cabin. Much closer. It was right outside the front door. My stomach dropped. There was no way the wind could have moved it that far. Someone had moved it. Someone was out there. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it out the window, but I couldn't see anyone. The forest was silent. I didn't know what to do. My phone didn't have service out here, and I didn't want to go outside to check. I decided to lock the doors and try to go back to sleep, though it was hard to relax knowing that someone had been outside my cabin. I finally drifted off, but I woke up again a few hours later to the same noise. This time, it was louder, closer. It sounded like footsteps, like someone was walking around the cabin. I stayed still, trying to calm my breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I was paralyzed with fear. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I could hear them standing just outside, almost like they were waiting. I didn't dare move. I listened, hoping they would go away, but the silence stretched on. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps again, moving away from the door. I let out a shaky breath. I waited a few minutes before getting up and looking out the window. The camping gear was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I kept the lights off and stayed by the window, watching. There was no sign of anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every little sound made me jump. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside to look around. There was no trace of the camping gear or anyone else. It was like nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. Someone had been out there, moving closer and closer to the cabin throughout the night. I didn't feel safe anymore. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, determined to leave. I didn't want to stick around to see if whoever it was would come back. As I was loading my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the dirt outside the front door, there were fresh footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, like a man's. They circled around the cabin, leading back into the woods. I jumped in the car and drove out of there as fast as I could. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road stayed empty. I didn't stop until I was miles away from the cabin. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted. The whole thing felt like some kind of game, like they were testing me, seeing how close they could get without being caught. I haven't gone camping since. The scariest part is not knowing. Not knowing who was out there, what they wanted, or why they didn't try to get inside. I rented a small cabin for the weekend, just to get away for a bit. It was supposed to be peaceful. I had been feeling stressed, overwhelmed by everything, and thought some time in the woods would help clear my head. The cabin was about 20 minutes off the main road, tucked away by itself. No other cabins nearby, which was fine by me. I liked the idea of being alone. The first night was quiet. I made some tea, read a book by the fire, and went to bed early. But when I woke up, I heard something. At first, I thought it was wind or maybe the owls settling. You know how old places creak and groan. But this wasn't that. It was a scratching sound. Faint at first, but once I fully woke up, I realized it was coming from beneath the cabin. I thought maybe an animal had gotten under there, some raccoon or something. I tried to ignore it, thinking it would go away. But the scratching didn't stop. It came and went in bursts, sometimes soft, sometimes louder. It bothered me enough that I couldn't go back to sleep. I got up, put on my jacket, and went outside to check. There was nothing obvious when I walked around the cabin. It was pitch black, though, and I couldn't see much. I had a flashlight, but the beam wasn't very strong. I didn't want to get too close to the crawl space under the cabin. The ground sloped down at the back, and there was an opening big enough for animals to get in. I shined the light, but I couldn't see anything moving. Just some dead leaves and dirt. I decided it wasn't worth poking around in the dark, so I went back inside. The scratching had stopped by the time I lay down again, and I was able to fall back asleep. The next morning, I was drinking coffee on the porch when I heard it again. That scratching, this time louder. Like something was really trying to dig under there. I put my cup down and went to investigate, this time in daylight. I looked around the back of the cabin, where I had seen the crawl space opening the night before, and noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were fresh scratches in the dirt, like something had been dragged. I crouched down and saw that the opening was bigger than it had been last night. It looked like someone had pulled away more of the boards. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I figured maybe some animal was nesting down there. I didn't know what else it could be, but part of me felt uneasy. The scratches were too deliberate, too neat. It didn't look like something an animal would do. I grabbed a shovel I had found in the shed up back and tried to push some dirt and leaves back into the hole, figuring I could block it off for the night. As I was pushing dirt into the hole, I heard something else. It wasn't scratching this time, but a soft shuffling sound, like someone moving inside the cabin. I stood up straight, heart pounding, and listened. The sound was coming from under my feet. I wasn't sure what to do at first. The sound stopped as soon as I moved, like whoever, or whatever, was down there had heard me. I walked back inside, locked the door, and sat down on the couch. My heart wouldn't stop racing. I thought about calling someone, but who? I was miles away from anyone, and it wasn't like I could call the police about some scratching sounds. They'd think I was crazy. The scratching didn't come back for the rest of the day, and I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe it was just an animal. But when night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to go to bed early again, but I kept hearing things. Small noises. Creaks. The wind, maybe. I couldn't tell. Then, around midnight, the scratching came back. Louder this time. Not just scratching, though. There was a tapping sound, like something knocking against wood. I sat up in bed, listening, my whole body tense. The noise was directly under me, under the floorboards. I couldn't just lie there and listen to it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight, put on my shoes, and went outside. I circled the cabin, stopping at the crawl space. It looked the same as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. I crouched down and shined the light under the cabin, expecting to see something move. But there was nothing. I stood up, ready to go back inside, when I noticed something strange. There was a small trapdoor hidden in the ground, just to the side of the crawl space. It was half buried under dirt and leaves, but I could see the outline of it now that I was looking closely. I hadn't noticed it before. I should have walked away. I should have left it alone. But I didn't. Something about the door made me feel like I had to know what was inside. I crouched down and pulled at the handle. It was heavy, and the hinges creaked as I lifted it. A damp, musty smell hit me as soon as the door opened. I shined the flashlight into the darkness and saw a set of stairs leading down. The stairs were old, rotting wood, and they disappeared into the dark. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to shut the door and go back inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see what was down there. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. The air was thick and heavy, and it smelled like mildew and something else I couldn't place. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the deeper I went, the colder it got. I reached the bottom and found myself in what looked like an old basement or cellar. It was small, with dirt walls and a low ceiling. The floor was uneven, and there were a few broken pieces of furniture scattered around. That's when I saw it. In the far corner, there was a small pile of blankets and a few empty cans of food. Someone had been living down here. Recently. My heart started racing again, and I backed up, ready to bolt up the stairs. But then I heard a noise. A soft shuffling, like someone moving in the dark. I turned the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but I didn't see anything. The sound was coming from behind the pile of blankets. I froze. The sound stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard a voice. A low, raspy whisper. Help me. I dropped the flashlight and ran. I didn't stop until I was back inside the cabin, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely lock it. I stood there, panting, listening. There was nothing. Just silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, clutching the flashlight, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No more scratching, no more voices. Just silence. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the nearest town and found a hotel. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't know how to explain it, and I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. But I know I heard. And I know someone was down there, living under the cabin, watching me.